Heraclon Publishing presents The Greatest Athlete You've Never Heard Of by Mark Hebscher. Read by me, Mark Hebscher. The Greatest Athlete You've Never Heard Of. This book is dedicated to those who never received the credit or notoriety they deserved, regardless of their profession or walk of life. The achievements of those who endeavored to make the world a better place should not go unnoticed. Foreword by Ron McLean. Back in 1990, I was seated next to my esteemed CBC colleague Brian Williams at the Academy of Canadian Cinema and Television Awards. We were both nominees in the Best Sportscaster category. On stage, Mark Hebscher had just opened the envelope and was about to present the winner. Brian cleared his throat in anticipation of delivering his winning acceptance speech. I often tease Brian about this. Of course, he always has the last laugh. He did win and was ever gracious in his remarks. But something else stood out for me that night. After Mark announced the winner, he made eye contact with Brian, then shifted his gaze to me and raised an eyebrow. There was a smile on his face and a twinkle in his eye that said to me, "It's okay, Ron, you are in the game." I never forgot that. I knew in that moment that Mark Hebscher saw beyond victory. He saw more than either the camera or the crowd was inclined to study. I knew back in 1990 that Mark could produce a book such as this. Now, nearly 3 decades after that award show, Mark has looked into something else unseen, the story of a little-known Canadian sports figure by the name of George Orton. This book is a remarkable mix of sleuthing and storytelling, and I love that it is a tale anchored in Canada, but set in Philadelphia, the cradle of democracy, and the place where Orton came into his own. It's the city I associate with Thomas Paine, author of 2 must-read manifestos for broadcasters, Common Sense and Rights of Man. A multitude of Canadian athletes have written great chapters of their lives in Philly. Flyer captains Bobby Clarke and Eric Lindros, Matt Stairs of St. John, New Brunswick, who hit the most memorable home run in Philadelphia Phillies history. Todd McCulloch of Winnipeg, who played basketball for the 76ers and at the same time for Team Canada at the 2000 Sydney Olympics. And Super Bowl champion Mark Rypien, who completed his last pass in the NFL as an Eagle. But only one Canadian athlete's story bridges Canada and Philadelphia by combining the words of sports doctrine and sporting deeds. One story in which public issues result in the forfeit of personal prudence. It's the story of a gold medal winner, but it is also much more. It is the story of a man who did not leave his mark in Canadian sports history until it was left to Mark to tell his story. Introduction. First-time author, long-time reader. It all started with a simple trivia question. Who was the first Canadian to win an Olympic gold medal? The answer took me on a bewildering 2-year odyssey. Rendered disabled at age 3, the individual in question recovered to become the most dominant athlete of his generation, despite a withered arm. As a distance runner and steeplechase champion, he was without peer. His skills in ice hockey and soccer were rarely matched. He was brilliant, too, fluent in 9 languages and armed with a PhD in philosophy. His revolutionary instruction books on track and field can be found in the U.S. Library of Congress. He was an innovator in the sports world, introducing the idea of placing numbers on football jerseys so spectators could identify the players. He popularized the use of a stopwatch to ensure proper pace for track athletes. He introduced ice hockey to Philadelphia, forming the first teams and creating the first league, and was instrumental in building the first indoor arena in the city. He founded the Philadelphia Children's Playground Association, started 2 summer camps, coached championship track and field teams, and nurtured the Penn Relays into a world-class track meet. He taught and coached at some of the finest prep schools, was a respected and eloquent writer and poet, brought the Army-Navy football series to Philadelphia on a permanent basis, and was enshrined in 7 halls of fame, all posthumously. Surprisingly, the man I'm speaking of was born, raised, and educated in Canada, but nobody ever knew of him, and his story blew me away. What follows is the story of George Washington Orton, possibly the greatest athlete you've never heard of. Chapter 1. The biggest race of his life. It is not the size, nor build, nor physique, nor qualities of inherited ancestry that determines a track and field champion. The boy of slender build and of apparent constitutional weakness may turn out to be another George Orton, invincible in the distance runs. Donald W. Hendrickson, 1909. Imagine you're 3 years old. You love to run and jump and play with your friends, but the doctor has just told your parents that you may never be able to walk or use your right arm again because of a terrible accident. You lie in bed, paralyzed, while your friends play outside. You dream of someday running again, fast, faster than all your friends, faster than everyone in the world. On a brutally hot July afternoon in Paris, a slender, curly-haired man with a shrunken arm is running in the Olympic 2,500-meter steeplechase. He had predicted in the newspaper that he would win the gold medal in this event, but he is in fourth place, and victory seems unlikely. The year is 1900. George Washington Orton is the most decorated distance runner in the world, having won over 120 championships in the United States, Canada, England, France, Belgium, Holland, and Germany. At age 20, he had earned his bachelor's degree from the University of Toronto. When he was 23, he became one of the youngest to earn a PhD at the University of Pennsylvania. He looks more like a scholar than a world-class athlete, though. He is 5 feet 6 inches tall and weighs 120 pounds. He squints a lot, like he needs eyeglasses. A week earlier, the English Track and Field Championships had been held at Stamford Bridge, home of the London Athletic Club. In 1898, Orton won the 2-mile steeplechase there, demolishing the field by 80 yards and becoming the first North American to win the coveted title. It took 24 years before an athlete from outside Great Britain won the steeplechase again. By 1900, Orton was already a racing legend in Great Britain, and large crowds had come to see him and the other North American track and field stars in advance of the Paris Olympics. But in the windy and damp conditions of Stamford Bridge, it was English champion Sidney Robinson who won the steeplechase that year, with Orton finishing a distant fourth. It was a painful defeat for Orton, who was in rough shape after a gut-wrenching 10-day ocean voyage from America. He vowed to get better and defeat Robinson and the others at the upcoming Olympics. Orton had been hired as a special correspondent by the Philadelphia Inquirer under the byline George Orton, the famous Pennsylvania athlete. One of his assignments was to provide an insider's look at the Olympic track and field events and predict the winners of each discipline. He mostly chose North American athletes to win, believing them to be superior to the Europeans. And when it came time to preview the 2,500-meter steeplechase, Orton did not beat around the bush. Quote, "Orton has more speed than the others," he wrote, "and as he is a good jumper, he should win if in condition." It was simple and succinct. He predicted victory, but in the third person, as if he were talking about someone else. But Orton was not in condition on this day, not even close. He hasn't been right since leaving America nearly 4 weeks earlier. 45 minutes earlier, he had finished a close third in the 400-meter hurdles, becoming the first Canadian to win an Olympic medal, although he may not have been aware of the significance of that feat at that moment. While his opponents in the steeplechase were resting up for their big event, Orton was hurdling against the world's best. The Olympic track and field events that year were contested on the grounds of the Racing Club of France, in the Bois de Boulogne, a huge park located in western Paris that's 2.5 times the size of New York's Central Park. It may have been perfect for picnics, but it was a terrible choice as the venue for the Olympic Games. As Orton pointed out, quote, "The grounds are very picturesque, but not as well adapted for athletes as they might be." He was being very kind. The biggest problem was the track itself. There wasn't one. The French had refused to install a cinder track in their municipal park. There was no way they were going to tear up their beautiful grass for foot racing. Instead, they laid out an irregular-sized 500-meter oval, standard size is 400 meters, on uneven grass. Orton pointed out that the track leads around beneath the trees, and its condition was so poor that no less than 4 sprinters broke down. The steeplechase course was especially brutal. Jumps consisted of authentic stone walls that couldn't be moved, thick hedges that were difficult to vault, and imposing water hazards. Even if one could successfully negotiate the water jump, a soaker would await you on the other side. The hurdles for the steeplechase were 1 meter high and fashioned from 30-foot-long telephone poles that had been stripped. None of the obstacles could be knocked down, unlike those in the hurdles events, which would fall fairly easily upon contact. Conditions for the field events were hardly better. The last few yards of the running broad jump approach featured a 6-inch incline. There were reports of some jumpers having to dig their own pits. As well, the venue was not spectator-friendly. The Bois de Boulogne was at least a mile from any tramway and far from the nearest railroad station. This inaccessibility affected the attendance greatly, said Orton, which was disappointing considering the caliber of the runners and the importance of the events. Gaining a good view of the track was another issue. Most spectators had their sightlines obstructed by a large grove of trees that made up the far end of the racecourse. Those who were fortunate enough to have the latest invention, binoculars, had the best view of the action. Orton may have predicted victory in the newspaper, but he confessed 2 weeks later that he was anything but confident the day of the Olympic 2,500-meter steeplechase. No man received a worse drubbing than I in the English steeplechase championship. I must confess, while I did not fear defeat in Paris, I knew I was against the best of the old world and was pretty sure to be beaten. The race is sort of a dream to this day. We were all racing for the lead, and at the end of the mile, we were dead to the world. A long stretch of woods was in the corner of the field and partially hid the backstretch. I was running fourth and seemed to be out of the race as Sidney Robinson was running strongly. About 300 yards from home, I seemed to realize that I was in the race for which I had come 4,000 miles. As the field headed for the treacherous water jump, Orton trailed Robinson, French champion Jacques Chastany, and American Arthur Newton. Orton's childhood dream may have propelled him at that point. The fear of having to eat crow because of his newspaper prediction also provided the likely impetus to get a move on. After the water, the runners would head through the trees at the far end of the backstretch and then turn for home. Nobody thought Orton had a chance, except the man with a clock in his head. You see, Orton had a near-perfect sense of pace. It was innate. He had perfected the art of running and waiting. In most of his races, Orton would conserve his energy by running perfectly timed intervals, falling behind, and then finishing with a big kick, bolting past his opponents in dramatic fashion. Most distance runners of the day did not have Orton's discipline. They ran as fast as they could for as long as they could before quitting or collapsing. Orton ran like a man with ice water coursing through his veins. Cool as can be, he would wait until the last possible moment before making his move, and most of the time, it resulted in victory. Because he was a brilliant mathematician and had diligently studied and practiced proper pacing since childhood, Orton could read a field of runners and know when to go and when to back off. When certain muscles became fatigued, he knew to change his gait and put less stress on them. He was one of the first on record to time his training intervals. He tried using a pocket watch initially, but the second hand was difficult to read and the watch too cumbersome. Orton felt that by fumbling with it, he was losing a second or two. And it's possible that his withered arm made it even more difficult, and he eventually scrapped the idea. Later, he learned that British military officers were using a newfangled way to tell the time while both hands were occupied: wristwatches. Orton fashioned a primitive one with leather straps and began utilizing it, checking his intervals often. In training, he could run a mile in 4 minutes 28 seconds. He paced himself with laps of 66, 68, 69, and 65 seconds. Even the most seasoned runners of the day could not run the final lap faster than the opening lap. The fact that a teenager could do it was nothing short of amazing. Orton always appeared relaxed during his races, without the strained look of a man gasping for air, face contorted, lungs ready to burst. There are many photos of the legendary long-distance runner Paavo Nurmi, the Flying Finn, carrying a stopwatch in training and in races. He also looks confident and relaxed, as if he knows he's going to win. In 1924, Nurmi, who won a record 9 Olympic gold medals in track, was dubbed the father of perfect pace. But George Orton's 100-plus victories and strict attention to time decades before the invention of the stopwatch should be recognized here. The grandfather clock of perfect pace. That seems like a good handle. Back on the grass oval that Sunday in Paris, Sidney Robinson maintained his lead and was running without distress. After winning the week before in London, Robinson was poised to take the gold medal. Orton, still running fourth, decided to make his move with an all-out sprint, urged on by some of his Penn teammates. Many in the crowd were well aware of Orton's legendary finishing kick and rose to their feet as the former Penn runner gave it the old college try. Just then, the crowd lost sight of the runners, their views obstructed by the trees. When the runners entered the forest, Orton was fourth. When they emerged, he was in the lead. Many were certain he had somehow lost the course and taken a shortcut. It appeared to be an optical illusion. How did he make up so much ground so quickly? As per his usual M.O., Orton had timed his run perfectly, blowing past his rival Robinson with 100 yards to go. From there, he thundered down the stretch in front of the cheering crowd like a runaway freight train, flying over the final hurdle, winning handily, and setting a world record, 7 minutes, 34 and 4/5 seconds. Immediately upon breaking the tape, Orton raised his arms in triumph and collapsed, likely from a combination of exhaustion and elation. Robinson, the runner-up, fell right behind him 5 seconds later. It was a sensational victory, as thrilling a race as anyone would see in these Olympics. Orton had erased a 20-yard deficit between him and Robinson in the final 300 yards to snatch the victory. According to the New York Times, the steeplechase created a greater enthusiasm than all other events of the day. Despite suffering from what would later be diagnosed as a stomach virus, Orton had made good on his newspaper prediction, and his childhood dream had come true. In less than 1 hour, he had won 2 Olympic medals, a bronze and a gold. It would be 84 years before another Canadian, Marita Payne, would win 2 Olympic track medals on the same day. Years later, Payne's fame rose again when her son Andrew Wiggins became the #1 pick in the National Basketball Association's 2014 draft and went on to take Rookie of the Year honors. Wiggins, and by extension his mother Marita, are as famous in Canada as Orton is obscure. Orton was considered to be an American for many years after that victory, simply because he ran as a representative of the University of Pennsylvania. In his mind, though, the American sporting public included Canada, but he never competed for either nation. Nevertheless, Americans took ownership of this great champion, and his Canadian heritage rarely came up. It would be more than 70 years before Orton was officially and correctly recognized as a Canadian by the International Olympic Committee. But that didn't make him any less obscure. When Olympic researchers made the discovery in the early 1970s, Orton's Olympic gold and bronze medals were officially removed from the U.S. total and added to the Canadian tally. This announcement was made without fanfare and without notifying any member of the Orton family. There was no press release to announce the changes and no declaration that Orton was now a Canadian. Only a few people in Canada even knew about this discovery. And besides, Orton was already dead. The moment he crossed the finish line on that steamy Paris Sunday in 1900, George Orton became the greatest Canadian athlete since Confederation in 1867. His sterling performance would pave the way for Canadian multi-sport stars such as Lionel Conacher and Fanny Rosenfeld, voted the greatest Canadian athletes of the first half of the 20th century. Prior to Orton, only rower Ned Hanlon and weightlifter Louis Cyr could be considered dominant 19th century Canadian athletes, having beaten the best in the world consistently over a period of time. Competitive rowing was a popular professional sport in the mid to late 19th century. Winners received large cash prizes, and there was always heavy betting on the outcome. Ned Hanlon had started out as a teenage rum runner, rowing crates of whiskey from his home on Toronto Island across the harbor for his bootlegger father. Soon he was winning races, and from there his celebrity grew. He participated in numerous promotions, autograph sessions, and whistle-stop tours to encourage ticket sales and betting interest from the Nepean River in New South Wales, Australia, to Lachine, Quebec, and Chautauqua Lake, New York. He enjoyed meeting his adoring public and always found the time to show them how good he was on the water. Few could beat Hanlon straight up, so he would give his opponents head starts in time or distance in order to drum up betting. Occasionally, he would give his backers fits by making it look as if he wouldn't be able to catch up. In the end, though, he would usually make a spirited effort to win, although there were times when he would lose on purpose just to set up a rematch and then cash in by betting on himself. Look up the word showboat, and there's probably a picture of Ned Hanlon next to the definition. After he won the Centennial Regatta in Philadelphia in 1876, Hanlon returned home to marching bands and citizens lining the streets of Toronto to get a glimpse of the conquering hero. Many had bet on Hanlon to win, so the civic celebration was all that more festive. In 1880, a match race was set up on the Thames River in London, England, Hanlon versus Edward Trickett of Australia. Canadians bet over $40,000 on their native son. Australians bet over $100,000 on their man. Hanlon won easily, cementing his dubious position as Canada's greatest professional athlete. Professionals were considered to be unsavory characters at that time. Athletes and promoters would collude to stage events that were easy to fix in their favor. Cheating was frequent, and men like Hanlon engaged in questionable behavior that included dodging potential challengers until the conditions were right. Usually, it was all about the money, not the athletic competition. Cries of "fix" were frequent, and the public became increasingly wary of these sporting events and the men who ran them. Following his career as a sculler, Hanlon ran a hotel and became an alderman in Toronto. He coached the University of Toronto Rowing Club in 1897 before taking on the same role at Columbia University in New York. Ned Hanlon died of pneumonia in 1908 at age 52. Louis Cyr was the other prominent Canadian superstar prior to Orton. The strongest man in the world, was widely known for his remarkable physical feats. A biblical, Samson-like character, the 5'8" Cyr grew his hair long at his mother's suggestion. He could perform absurd exhibitions of strength. Rather than just lift more weight than his competitors, he constructed his own special events to showcase his legendary power. His specialty was the one-finger lift. He once managed 534 pounds. There was the time in Boston where he allegedly backlifted a platform holding 18 men, generously estimated to weigh over 4,000 pounds. There's a famous photo of Cyr holding the reins of 4 horses, 2 on each side, trying to run in opposite directions while their grooms cracked whips to encourage the horses to move him, to no avail. These events would often occur during exhibitions of strength that were organized and promoted by Cyr himself. He would push a railway freight car up an incline and then dare any 2 men to duplicate the feat. Like Hanlon, Cyr was a showman and a capitalist, attracting large crowds by promising and delivering legendary feats of strength. He toured with a circus strongman show that featured the French Hercules, Horace Barr, as his assistant. But Cyr was far from athletic in his later years. By the time he had reached the age of 40, his weight had skyrocketed to over 400 pounds. He developed chronic nephritis, a disease that affects the kidneys, and was likely brought about by the constant strain of heavy lifting. Louis Cyr died in 1912 at age 48. Cyr and Hanlon were famous wherever they went. Orton never received the same attention, partly because he wasn't a personality like Cyr and Hanlon. He didn't have a shtick. The athletes the newspapers wrote about in those days had personality. Unfortunately, most of the 19th century Canadian history we learned when I was in school wasn't nearly as interesting as American history. We didn't have Benjamin Franklin or Abraham Lincoln or Thomas Edison or P.T. Barnum to write home about. No offense to Alexander Graham Bell or Laura Secord, of course. And there wasn't a lot written about Canadian culture, music, art, architecture, dance, literature, or even athletics. Instead, our history seemed to be about politics, industry, finance, exploration, mining, the building of the railroad, and so on. Orton's story had not been told in the history books alongside those of Hanlon and Cyr. He was never referenced as a champion athlete alongside Percy Williams, Barbara Ann Scott, and the other Canadians who reached the pinnacle of Olympic achievement. Orton did not have an agent or a public relations person to beat the drums about his many accomplishments, although he did consider himself a publicity man in later years. He didn't hold running exhibitions or feats of endurance, although he did once put on a fast skating exhibition to promote an ice rink in Philadelphia. Humility is a wonderful trait, and it came naturally to Orton, who rarely tooted his own horn. His newspaper prediction prior to the Olympics showed a quiet confidence along with an admirable level of sportsmanship. To make one's point in the third person, rather than shouting it from the rooftops, says a lot. Some of our schoolboys are fast and strong enough to become crack basketballers, and they are snapped up by some enterprising manager of a professional team. It also frequently happens that men are taken from amateur teams to fill the ranks of the professional leagues. All such men are ineligible for any branch of amateur athletics. It is the duty of the Amateur Athletic Union to see to it that such men do not compete as amateurs, as has very often occurred. There is no disgrace in being a professional athlete, but a distinct wrong is done to amateur athletics when professionals try to foist themselves off as amateurs. Between 1892 and 1901, Orton won a reported 121 races, from the 400-meter hurdles to the 10-mile steeplechase, and nearly every distance and discipline in between. He won a staggering 32 international and national championships during that time. His 17 U.S. national titles in track and field was a record that stood for 50 years, and that total would have been much greater, but unlike today, some events were not run every year during Orton's prime. For example, the 3-mile, 5,000-meter championship was contested only twice between 1880 and 1902, and the cross-country race took place just twice over an 8-year period, Orton winning it both times, in 1897 and 1898. Orton also won the 5-mile championship in 1892, but that race was never contested again. Had Orton had the opportunity to compete in some of these canceled or discontinued events, I am fairly certain he would be the all-time record holder for U.S. championships in track. But as far as I know, he never once mentioned these lost opportunities. Incidentally, the same would be true of his Canadian numbers. Had he been allowed to compete in all of his favorite events, Orton surely would have garnered more than 7 Canadian championships. Virtually unnoticed was his incredible record for the 1-mile run, 4:21 4/5, set in 1892. No Canadian would eclipse that record on Canadian soil until 1934, when Les Wade of Montreal trimmed 1/5 of a second off that time. Imagine holding a record for 42 years. If I had accomplished any of those feats, I'm pretty sure I would have said something about it, but Orton never mentioned any of his sporting accomplishments in the many books or articles I have read. He did not refer to himself as an Olympic, world, or national champion, even though he held all those titles. He was humble and unassuming, and those qualities likely cost him well-earned accolades and recognition. When asked about his career, he considered himself only a fair runner, despite what the record book said. Today, an Olympic champion returns to a hero's welcome and endorsement opportunities aplenty. The day after Orton won his gold and bronze medals, the Toronto Star headline screamed, "Canada beats the whole world." That was misleading, though. The story had nothing to do with Orton's victory. "In its fruit display at Paris Exposition," read the subheading. The following day, a smaller headline on page 6 of the Star shouted, "A famous victory." But underneath, the text added, George Orton's 2,500-meter steeplechase victory at Paris Exposition was a sensational affair, as the cablegrams show. You see, the Star didn't mention that Orton was from Canada because the entire story was copied from the New York Times, which didn't mention that Orton was from Canada either, only that he ran for the University of Pennsylvania. At the time, the Star was one of 6 daily Toronto newspapers. The Globe, World, and Mail and Empire were the morning papers, while the Telegram, News, and a later edition of the Globe were published in the afternoon. The Montreal Star had the largest circulation in the country at the time, followed closely by the French-language La Presse. None had sent a representative to the 1900 Paris Olympics. Members of the press who did travel to France deemed fruit at the Paris Exposition to have a greater importance than world-class athletes. Orton's appearance in the Olympic steeplechase apparently had no chance against Northern Spy apples and Bing cherries. Consequently, there were no Canadian stories featuring quotes from the victor and perspective from the track and field correspondent. Every Olympic story that appeared in the Canadian papers originated from the New York Times or one of the other news services. The Grant brothers from St. Mary's, Ontario, did not get a mention in the St. Mary's Journal, except that they were grouped with the other American boys at the Olympics. George Orton may as well have been from Mars. His gold medal victory at the Olympics went unreported in Canada. Because of this oversight, planned or otherwise, Orton's significant achievement flew under the radar for decades until it became a trivia question. Over the years, there have been major errors and omissions regarding Orton's life and accomplishments. I don't understand why anyone would not consider him to be a Canadian through and through. Even though Orton was the first to achieve Olympic gold, others are still credited with winning that first medal, according to the Dictionary of Canadian Biography. Etienne Desmarteau is remembered for his victory at the 1904 Olympics in St. Louis, Missouri, when he managed a throw of 34 feet 4 inches in the 56-pound weight contest. He was long regarded as the first Canadian to have earned a gold medal, although not all experts agree. Some claim the honor belongs to George Orton, who had won the 2,500-meter steeplechase in Paris 4 years earlier. Orton, a Canadian by birth, was, however, wearing the colors of the United States, where he was studying. Others maintain that Desmarteau should be considered the first since George Seymour Lyon's victory in the golf competition at St. Louis in 1904 ought to be disregarded, golf having been included in the Olympic Games only that one time. Golf was brought back for the 2016 Olympics. There are 8,500 entries in the Dictionary of Canadian Biography. I was shocked to discover that George Orton is not one of them. Not a word. It's as if he never set foot in Canada, much less won 2 Olympic medals confirmed by the IOC in the 1970s. Meanwhile, the biographies of Desmarteau and Lyon, neither of whom were the first to win gold, are listed. If these so-called experts couldn't agree on Orton's status as a Canadian, where exactly were they drawing their expertise from? I contacted the folks at the dictionary to let them know of their oversight, hoping they would take this new information under advisement and add Orton's biography to their vast collection. They replied by email on November 14, 2017. Please note, we are currently working on Volume 16, which contains biographies of persons who died between 1931 and 1940. Given that George Washington Orton died in the late 1950s, it will be some time before it comes time to consider him for inclusion. Now, I'm sure that there are many Canadians worthy of inclusion, but I'll bet none of them are in the Canadian Sports Hall of Fame, the Canadian Olympic Hall of Fame, the University of Toronto Sports Hall of Fame, the Ontario Sports Hall of Fame, and the London Ontario Sports Hall of Fame. Orton made a significant contribution to society and was a positive influence on countless people. Why does he still need to be considered for inclusion when several reputable sources had confirmed him as a Canadian? In November of 1983, the respected Olympic Review wrote of Orton, quote, "Although official records since 1904 have always listed Etienne Desmarteau as the first ever Canadian Olympic gold medalist, George Orton, hitherto always known as the American winner of the 2,500-meter steeplechase in Paris in 1900, was in fact a Canadian." Orton was already well known in North America and Europe by 1900, so the decision made by the newspapers not to cover his exploits or those of other Canadians competing in Paris was confusing to me, especially since they had followed the careers of Hanlon and Sears so closely. Orton had moved from Toronto to Philadelphia at age 20 to further his education and prolong his athletic career at Penn. Why were Canadian journalists no longer interested in the subject of many of their past stories? Perhaps they believed Orton to be a dirty American professional, interested more in money than the love of sport, and not willing to uphold the values of pure amateurism, which was considered to be a Canadian virtue. The amateur code of the time would not allow athletes to accept prize money, admission money, or any payment for coaching, teaching, or even assisting athletes. At the same time, amateurs were expected to pay all the costs associated with competing: equipment, club memberships, travel, food, lodging, and so on. That meant nearly all the amateurs of the day were men from upper-class families in big cities who could afford to pursue their sport at a private club and not have to worry about making a living at the same time. Orton, they must have figured, would fall victim to the lure of money and fame once he moved to the United States. To them, he was turning his back on his country. As a Canadian and an amateur, he was dead to them. The more I uncovered about Orton, the more his story intrigued me. I wanted to find out how a man so multi-talented could be so overlooked by his native country. Today, most Canadians are quick to point out anyone who has any remote association with Canada. An actress who rented an apartment in Toronto for a few years before being swept away by a prince, for example. That's good enough for some. We're going to adopt you, and we're going to make you an honorary Canadian. Yet here's an actual Canadian-born fellow who's been dead for years and still gets less respect than Rodney Dangerfield. This injustice led me to undertake a project that would occupy the next 2 years of my life and strengthen my resolve to tell the story of this obscure yet remarkable man who, against all odds, achieved what very few had done before or since. Chapter 2. The Documentary. I lost my longtime TV job in December 2015. I won't get into it, but let's just say things worked out all right. It provided an opportunity to tell the story that had started out as a trivia question. As a television reporter, I had learned to tell a story in the amount of time it takes you to wash your hands. A few good visuals, a solid interview clip or two, and a nice stand-up in front of the camera. Boom! Some creative writing and a relevant voiceover, and there's your 80 or 90 seconds. But this documentary I was envisioning would be close to an hour, a daunting task, especially since the subject had been dead for 60 years. Orton may have been the greatest athlete I'd never heard of, but dead men tell no tales. It would be up to those who knew him or knew of him to fill in the blanks for me. In the pre-internet era, I wouldn't have even tried to tell a story like this on my own. But with search engines and all kinds of digital archives available, there was plenty of information to discover in order to put together a great story. It would require a tremendous amount of research, something I was not unfamiliar with, and I certainly had the time. I also didn't need to worry about anybody beating me to this story. I was pretty sure that nobody in their right mind was chasing down leads for a George Orton biography. My plan was to scour the internet and visit libraries, historical societies, and archives. I would call and email everyone I knew who might have any insight or suggestions. I would write a script, prepare questions, determine shooting locations, gather photos, newspaper clippings, and documents, delve into Orton's family history, find relatives, friends, and other key interviewees, ask all the right questions, dig doggedly for answers, and use my experience and enthusiasm to create a compelling documentary that everyone, not just Canadians, would want to see. Easy, right? I even paid for a subscription to Ancestry, one of those websites that traces your family back hundreds of years. The first thing they ask you is the name of the family member you want to search for. Oh, he's not a family member. Is that okay? When I entered George Orton, I suddenly felt as if I were his real great-grandson. I was trying to find out as much as I could about my great-grandfather, the one I never knew. Oh, I had heard stories, but you're never sure how much to believe about your relatives, right? I mean, what's truth and what's legend can easily become one and the same, especially when relatives tend to embellish the stories over the years. But what if you found out that your great-grandfather was the first Canadian to win an Olympic gold medal and nobody else knew about it? That's the way I was feeling. This man was now my surrogate, Great Zeta. When the time came to pitch the documentary idea to several broadcasters, I was pretty confident. I figured at least one executive would love the story, greenlight the project, and finance the whole production so that it could be released in time for Canada's sesquicentennial celebration in 2017, which turned out to be pretty lame. After all, who wouldn't love a story about an obscure Canadian who overcame incredible odds to win the first Olympic gold medal for his country, especially someone with such an American-sounding name? Yet the response to my pitch was underwhelming, to say the least. The needle didn't move at all. Don't call us, we'll call you. I was crushed. If the George Orton story was ever to be told, I would have to tell it alone. There would be no co-production with a big crew and a unit manager and a travel budget. It would be just me and my Visa card. When my wife was informed of this slight deviation in plans, she wondered aloud when I was going to get a real job and stop fantasizing about becoming a documentary filmmaker. But I couldn't stop now. There was a story to tell, and damn it, I needed to do this. A big challenge was the acquisition of pictures and other visuals. When you write a book, all you need are a bunch of photos if the subject matter is biographical, and maybe a map or a pie chart. But a documentary film requires tons of visuals to accompany the narrative. And where was I going to get those? Nobody wants to see talking heads all the time, so those shots must be covered with film, video, photos, newspaper and magazine articles, and other documents. I had one visual, one photo. Did I mention how challenging this was going to be? George Orton's only living relative, a granddaughter whose birth name was Constance Ulrich, would have been born in the early 1940s. I didn't know if she was alive, but her name didn't show up in any obituaries, so that was a good sign. I discovered she had been married at least 3 times, and it appeared as if she had changed her name after each marriage. There may have been some hyphenated versions of her surname over the years as well, and she might have gone back to her maiden name for a time. A real needle in a haystack. Constance hadn't been heard from since the 1990s, when she was a professor at Mills College in Oakland, California. I had contacted the folks there many months before, looking for any information as to her whereabouts. My hope was that she was A, alive, and B, lucid. I would hate to find out, after all this searching, that she had no stories to tell and no memories of anybody, much less her famous grandfather, my famous surrogate great-grandfather. I had even considered hiring a private investigator to help in